what it's worth. One day they will rule the earth. Here's to the farmer on the land, bending down in toil, harvesting the soil, working through the cold and heat, growing rice and wheat. One day they will rule the earth. And to the killers of our dreams, the leeches and their schemes, their hungry war machines, the bankers and the businessmen, those privileged from their birth, we will drive them from the earth.
Oh, Caleb! Hey! Caleb's here.
Oh my goodness, it's been
Nice
so
to
long.
see
How are
you.
you? Oh my goodness.
Sorry?
CPI! 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 CPI!
Out of the movement!
As the masses!
Out of the movement!
To the masses!
Out of the movement!
To the masses!
Out of the movement!
To the masses!
We are
CPI!
We are
City builders!
We are
City builders!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
All right, welcome everybody!
Thank you, Caleb.
All right.
We have a socialist world. We have the whole wide world to win. One more time, ready? We have a socialist world. We have a socialist world. We have the whole wide world to win. Thank you.
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
Dare to struggle!
Dare to win!
You're great. Paul is amazing, isn't he? Great. All righty. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. This is going to be our first presentation. There'll be a class this afternoon as well. But this will be our first presentation this morning. It'll be on the roots of our movement. So before we begin, I'd like everyone to just stand up and stretch a little bit, right? Some of us come from a long way. Some of us have slept a good night. Joe led us in some good exercises this morning. That was great. But just stretch out, and get comfortable in your chair, when you sit down. And the way we're going to do this is it'll be class and then discussion, and then class, discussion. Both classes will be in 4 parts. So that's how we'll do it. And so during the discussion, if possible, I think that they'll have a mic, and if you can pass the mic during the discussion, that'll be important. So I guess we'll begin. There's a long tradition of communists going out in nature and doing this kind of thing, and being out in the countryside among the people and getting some time away from the cities. I actually, when I joined a political group I was a member of, there was an 80-year-old woman that was kind of a mentor to me. She had gone to Camp Wo-Chi-Ka, and Wo-Chi-Ka stood for Workers' Children's Camp, and it was located in upstate New York. And she had pictures of herself with a little red beret on. And at Camp Wo-Chi-Ka, the members of the Young Pioneers Club would salute like this, right? And the salute, it had particular meaning, right? We know the fist and the origin of the fist. But the salute was actually, they saluted like this in particular because the thumb was below your ear. And that was for the Soviet Union. That was the 1/5 of the world that was already under the control of the working class. And the other 4 fingers were for the rest of the world that would soon be under the control of the working class. And so they were aiming for the day where they would be able to salute like this with their whole fist beneath their ear to symbolize the entire world having socialist revolution. So I thought that was pretty neat. She also talked about how they had nursery rhymes. They would say, 1, 2, 3, young pioneers are we. We're fighting for the working class against the bourgeoisie. And then there was another verse, actually, which nowadays we couldn't do because slang has changed, but it was 4, 5, 6, we are the Bolsheviks. We're fighting for the working class against the dirty dicks, which meant detectives and cops back then, but you can't do that one now, Yeah, there's a long tradition of this, and my hope is that this weekend can be the beginning of something. My hope is that maybe every one of you can be leading workshops like this and weekends like this around the country. And that, as the Center for Political Innovation grows, spreading a Marxist political message, that we can expand. And I want everyone in this room to become a leader, right? And I think that there is a lot of ego in this movement, right? There's a lot of people who think that they are the true revolutionary. Everyone else is a phony. And we need to figure out how we can empower other people. We just sang the ballad of Joe Stalin. You think about that, you think about what the Soviet Union became, and all the hard work and sacrifice, and all the great writers and musicians, and all the great Olympic athletes, and all the great electrical engineers and technicians, and that the strength of leadership is empowering other people, right? And that's something that is a knowledge that is almost missing in our movement in this time. And I'm really happy that folks have stepped up. And I mean, Joe was leading the exercises this morning. Paul has been doing great music and getting us through it. Other folks have been stepping up throughout the weekend. Gavin gave us a great opening invocation, a very, very moving spiritual introduction. And I want as many people to step up. Tonight we're going to have a talent show where anyone can get up. It'll be kind of an open mic talent show. Folks are going to sing. Folks are going to read poetry. It's going to be great. And that's what we want to do. We want this to be a place where people feel like they can belong, right? Because if you're a socialist in this society, you're going to feel at odds with everybody else. I mean, we live in a society where money comes first, and the rich and powerful have pushed their ideology so hard on us, and so it's going to be quite difficult for those of us who really want to change this and overturn it. But history is on our side. So on that note, I think we'll get started with the very first presentation. Now, we all know who that is, right? We should all know who that is. Now, he was not the first person to say the word socialism. The first use of the word socialism, it was in French. It was by Pierre Laroux, who was a follower of Henry Saint-Simon. And Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Human beings have been around for roughly 300,000 years, according to modern biology. 300,000 years. But Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, the first piece of definitive work of scientific socialism, in 1848. So in the span of human development, our movement and scientific socialism is very, very new. If you look at a map of human history, if you were to get a graph, we would be very, very new. But the thesis that I've put out in my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, and in the textbook, is that we are not new. That we represent a trend in the human species that has been around for a long time, since the dawn of civilization, really. Now, we're told that between the years 3000 and 4000 BC, that human beings, basically, they got too good at hunting and gathering. They developed sticks and rocks to kill animals with. They paid attention to the patterns in how plants grow, and they got too good at hunting and gathering. And it was between 3000 and 4000 BC that we had the first ecological crisis in history, because humans were too good at hunting and gathering. We were so good at our means of survival that there was a scarcity, and there was an ecological crisis. There was a shortage. There weren't enough animals to hunt. There were not enough fruits and nuts to gather, and there was an ecological crisis. And I would argue that the first leftists, the first revolutionaries in history, were those who said, you know what? Let's start growing our own food. Let's start domesticating animals. And the way we got out of the first ecological crisis was with human progress, by moving to a higher mode of production. And that is the tradition of Marxism. And as civilization and societies have emerged, that has been how we operate. We change the way we operate and interact with our environment. The history of humans from that time up to now is a history of constantly changing how we interact with nature, how we interact with it. Friedrich Engels, he said, "The animal merely uses its environment and brings about changes in it simply by its presence. But man, by his changes, makes it serve his ends. He masters it. And this is the final essential distinction between man and other animals." And as we developed, as human beings developed, we built civilizations. The civilizations that we built had ideologies to define them. Now, what is ideology? Well, if you want to know what ideology is, I know Slavoj Žižek wrote thousands of pages about what ideology is. I'll tell you what ideology is. A lot of us were driving here. I know, Dust James came in on his motorcycle, and some other folks have come. Imagine that you're driving down the road. You're driving down the road. When you're driving down the road, you know where you're going. You know where you came from. You know how you're getting there. That's ideology. And every civilization has its ideology. It tells you who you are. It tells you where you're going. It tells you where you came from. That's ideology. And that's the purpose that ideology serves. And every civilization has had its ideology. Its religion, its beliefs, its teachings that orient people as they're building civilizations together, that orients them where they're going, where they came from. And it serves a purpose. But Marxism is different than all other ideologies. And there's a very key difference between Marxism and all other ideologies, which is that every other ideology said it was eternal. Right? During the slave civilization, the slave civilizations, Egypt, Rome, Greece, they said that their ideology and their perspective was eternal, that humans had always existed that way. During the time of feudalism, kings and nobles and landowners and peasants, they said that their way was the natural order of things. It was the way it had always been. And now, during capitalism, how often have we seen this? That the capitalists maintain that it's just human nature. This is just the way people are. But Marxism says that nothing is eternal. Nothing is eternal. All that is solid melts into air. You never step into the same river twice. A does not equal A. And that is what separates Marxism from all the other ideologies invented by ruling classes in the past. They're all premised on this belief that their rule, their system is the eternal reality. Marxism does not do that, and that is what distinguishes it and makes it the scientific ideology that is superior to others. When we talk about the dialectic, right, that's the concept of contradiction. That first you have the thesis, then you have the antithesis. They clash, creating a new synthesis, and the synthesis then becomes the new thesis. But this is how history moves forward. There are clashes. Hegel said it was a clash of ideas. But Marx had the understanding that it was an economic basis, that society serves the economic base. For example, right, while we're constantly told that there is one eternal way the family is, how often have we heard this? I remember there was a bumper sticker I used to see when I was a kid. It said, marriage equals one man plus one woman, and then it would have a Bible verse. And I would always kind of laugh about that because how many wives did Ezekiel have, right? How many wives did so many people from the Old Testament have? And we know that under hunter-gatherer civilization, there really was not an institution of marriage. And then as slavery and feudalism got going, you had, polygamy, and eventually we have monogamy, and now we have gay marriage. And there is no eternal way that the family is. We also know that there's not an eternal political form, right? Under hunter-gatherer civilization, you had tribes with, there was probably some level of hierarchy, but no class structure. Under feudalism, you had the landowners and the peasants. And under capitalism, we now have the property owners and the workers, right? And that this is not eternal. This is the understanding that there is a contradiction. In the French Revolution, we know about the three estates. The French Revolution, you had, before the French Revolution, you had the church, you had the nobility, and you had the commoners. And the church and the nobility were basically the same structure, and the commoners were the third estate, and the third estate toppled the first two estates, and you had the emergence of the commoners becoming the new society, right? The toppling of the church as the ruling institution, the toppling of the state as the ruling institution. And as Mao said, one must always divide into two. And among the commoners, among the new class that emerged, you had the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, those who work for a living and sell their labor power to a boss, the capitalists, or the workers, those who must rent themselves out to survive, and the capitalists, those who own the factories. And that contradiction defined the new society, that one divided into two. The commoners, contradictions emerged among them. Now, there were many different voices that said capitalism was immoral, that said the rule of profits was immoral. That's capitalism, right? We had the profit motive and the irrationality of the market, replacing the will of man, right? At the time, for example, of feudalism, if they went and built a castle here, they built it because the king said so. At the time of feudalism, they plowed a field here, they plowed it because the noble said so. But capitalism supplanted the will of man for the rule of profits, for the rule of the market, the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production. and we had the rule of the dollar. Capitalism is defined by production organized for profit. Frederick Engels, he said, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. By Mao Zedong, he said, under capitalism, profits are in command. And capitalism is a system of production organized for profit. Many voices before Karl Marx had said that capitalism was immoral. In fact, critiques of capitalism from feudal institutions long predated any socialist or left-wing critique. Many people said capitalism was immoral. But Marx was the first to say that capitalism was irrational. And he pointed to the key problems with capitalism. And we're going to talk about those key problems. Is there someone who would like to, I have very sloppy handwriting. Is there someone who could volunteer to write on the board the 4 contradictions as I explain what they are? Someone who can just step up and write? Go ahead, Tristan. All right. First one would be production for profit not social use, or not use, right? And we've seen many examples of this in our lives. One example of production for profit, not use, that I've used many times before is that in New York City, you have a lot of restaurants in New York City. In New York City, we also have a lot of homeless people. And it's very common that in restaurants in New York City, at the end of the night, they have leftover food, and they'll take it to the dumpster, and before they just leave it there in the dumpster, they'll pour motor oil all over it. And why is that? That's so no homeless person can take it out of the garbage. And why would they do that? Well, if a homeless person gets that food out of the garbage, then they wouldn't buy it from the restaurant, because they didn't make that food so people could eat it. They made that food so they could make profits from it. That's production for profit, not for social use. Another example. I've told this story before, but I remember years ago I went to the movies. And I went to the movies, and I wanted to drink some unnamed diet beverage at the movies. So I walked into the movie theater. I had bought my ticket, and before I went up to the counter, before the movie started, and I said I would like a soda. And they said, that'll be $5.50. And I said, $5.50 for a soda? And they had already filled it up, and they put the ice in it. I said, well, I don't have $5.50. They said, oh, okay. And they poured it out, and they threw the cup away. Now, why did they do that, right? They still lost the same thing. Again, they didn't make that cup of soda for me to drink it. They made that cup of soda so they could make profits. That's capitalism, right? Capitalism is production for profit, not social use. Dakota Lilly made a video that went viral when he was in Union Square in New York City. And he found all kinds of coats in the middle of the winter, freezing cold, that were being thrown into the dumpsters near Union Square in New York City. But before they were thrown into the dumpsters, the store owners near there had taken blades and cut them up. Why? Because they didn't make those coats so that people could wear them and keep warm. They made those coats so that they could make a profit. And so to make sure no homeless person would take these coats out of the garbage, they had taken knives and cut up these coats that they threw away. And the video that Dakota made illustrating this point, went viral and went everywhere. People saw this. This is the irrational capitalist system. And Marx was the first to point to the irrationality of capitalism, not simply the immorality of inequality. And that's the analysis that's missing. There are many voices now suddenly criticizing capitalism. It's okay to criticize capitalism in the United States now. Finally, there's an opening. But many of the voices criticizing it don't have this scientific understanding. So the next point would be, if you can write, the general law of capitalist accumulation.
Terrific handwriting, by the way.
Yes, far better than I would do. Great work. So you have the general law of capitalist accumulation. And this is something that every capitalist is very well aware of, though a lot of working people are not, which is that if a capitalist enterprise is not expanding, it dies. The way the capitalist works is he invests, right? He hires workers to make products. They then sell those products. He makes profits from those products. And then he takes his profits and he reinvests them to make more profits. And then he reinvests them to make more profits. And at any point, a capitalist enterprise stops expanding, it dies. And so what is the result of that? That gradually some businesses go out of business and other businesses expand. And as this happens, you generally get a centralization of wealth in the hands of a few. If a capitalist enterprise is not expanding, it dies. But when you get to the point that one corporation or one business is dominant, then growth stops. And you get what's called monopolistic stagnation. Because at that point, when there are no competitors, there's no motivation for it to expand. So you have this frequent problem of capital centralizing and centralizing and centralizing as the capitalist is investing profits to make more profits, to make more profits, to make more profits. And eventually you get a situation where there's a monopoly, and then production comes to a grinding halt. And so the government has to step in and break up the monopolies. And the capitalists, it's so wild. There's all these claims that the problems with capitalism are because of the government. But there are all kinds of mechanisms invented by the capitalists and by the government to prevent reaching a state of monopolistic stagnation in order to keep accumulation going. For example, it is illegal, you may notice, there is a very wealthy business owner in China. He owns AMC movie theaters. And he was going to buy one of the Hollywood studios. And the US government said, no, you cannot do that because it is illegal to own a movie studio in Hollywood and to own a movie theater. And why is that? Because of the general law of capitalist accumulation. Because if a movie theater and a movie studio were owned by the same company, then they would only show their movies in the movie theater. And as a result of that, pretty soon you'd have a monopoly. There are other laws like this that prevent monopolistic stagnation. In order to keep capitalism in a state of constant expansion, you have to break up monopolies because the tendency is for the centralization of wealth in the hands of the few. So that's the general law of capitalist accumulation. Number 3, the problem of overproduction. So the capitalist hires the worker to work in his factory and sell the products. But the worker is never paid enough to buy back the products that he produces, right? And in fact, you want to write, so let's start out, you've got A, which is the materials to make the product, A. It's like a math problem, like A. Oh, yeah, all good. A, so A, right, plus B, which is the shipping of the product. Okay. Right, plus C, which is the labor costs. Right, and then D, which is the price. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here. So if A plus B plus C equals D, how does the capitalist make a profit? The only way the capitalist can make a profit is by cutting into C. So you have C1, the labor costs, and C2, which is the capitalist profit, so the surplus value. And that's why Marxism maintains workers are exploited, because they're not getting the full value of their labor. In order for the worker to get the full value of their labor, there could be no profit for the capitalist. The capitalist profits are C2. The total price of the product is D, and C1 is what the worker gets paid. C1 can never equal D. Can you write C1 does not equal D? There's no way that the worker can be paid enough to buy back the product he produces. There will always be more products than there are consumers. The worker is also the consumer, and the worker can never buy back the product he produces. And this is the problem of overproduction. And capitalist production cannot overcome this problem, right? And so the capitalist is constantly looking for ways to deal with this. And generally, the boom-bust cycle that we've heard about is rooted in this problem. Pretty soon the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. And this is due to the problem of overproduction. However, that brings us to point number 4. Point number 4 is the tendency for the falling rate of profit. So the capitalist wants to maximize C2, his profits. In order to do that, he wants to cut in and pay as little as he can for C1, the labor, right? The less labor that he pays for, the more his profits increase. But the capitalist cannot cut in to the shipping costs. He cannot cut in to the costs of the materials for the product. He can only advance his rate of profit. He can only advance his profits by cutting into the labor, right? By paying less for the worker. And that's why we hear all about, how they de-skill jobs, for example. How many short order cooks are there nowadays? Not many, right? You go to McDonald's, making food is almost like an assembly line practically, because they want to make the workers easily replaceable so they can pay them less. You talk about machines replacing labor. That's all about this, about maximizing the profits. But the problem is that as you reduce the role of labor in production, right, as the value of C becomes less, the rate of profit overall decreases, because he can only make profit by cutting into C. And if C becomes less and less, you have the falling rate of profits. So as the capitalist system functions, we have seen historically that the greatest economic crises come in the aftermath of big technological leaps. The problem of overproduction and the problem of the tendency for the falling rate of profits becomes exacerbated when there is a big technological leap. And World War I came after great technological innovations. World War II came after great technological innovations. And the reason that we're in the situation that we're in right now around the world, with so much unrest and so much hunger and so much suffering, is because we are living in the aftermath of probably the greatest technological leap that we've ever seen. 3D printers, for example. You talk about these books. They have print on demand. You push a button and a book comes out. There used to be thousands of people who worked in book binderies, just binding books all day. It used to be in order to print a book, you had to print 5,000 copies of it, or it just wasn't cost effective. But now, one book can be printed by pushing a button. This is one of the greatest technological leaps we've ever seen, and as a result, it's creating a prolonged economic crisis. And that's the situation that we are in the 21st century. Now, what's the solution to this? What's the solution to this problem? Well, Karl Marx advocated that the working class, the proletariat, those who sell their labor to survive, those with nothing to lose but their chains, in order to resolve these problems, that they, on behalf of all of society, rise up and take control of the means of production. And the banks, factories, and industries, and the major centers of economic power should be forced to work for the good of all and not simply for the profits of their owners. That the means of production should be controlled by the people. And once you can get rid of this, you can erase that now because it's gone. Once you get rid of that, at that point, growth can no longer be interrupted. You can have uninterrupted economic growth because these problems are eliminated. With the ending of these problems and this stagnation of capitalism, you get the basis for the eventual emergence of the higher stage of communism, which is a post-scarcity society. The idea is with vast material abundance, inequality can fade away. When everyone has enough, who needs to hoard and have more than somebody else? The state can fade away. You can have a society where people kind of just do what they want to do and take what they need. With technological advancement, we can have vast material abundance. It's important to point out, Joe Biden has been giving a lot of speeches where he talks about the concept of natural rights. And this is very important, right? That the ideology that our ruling class is promoting, they promote this idea that the rights that we have under our system are natural, right? And that every society in all history, under all circumstances, should have the exact same level of civil liberties that we have now. But that is a completely immaterial perspective. That's what I was talking about before, where they project the eternality onto their particular ideology. If you had gone around in year 1000 and walked around and said, I think everyone should be able to say whatever they want, and I think everyone should believe whatever they want, and we should vote for, people would have thought you were a lunatic. Because in order to sustain that level of production, you had to have a political form that matched it. Feudalism didn't emerge because people are bad and just didn't think that people had enough rights and just didn't recognize that people had rights. Nobody was talking about the right to freedom of speech and the right of freedom of assembly and the rights of man until the 1400s or 1500s in Europe. And why was that? Is that because Europeans are just better? Is that because the West is the best? Is that because people were evil until then and they just discovered morality? Of course not. It's because the economic base had not been there. And our belief is that the economic base will get bigger to allow for even more freedom, and that communism, a society without any scarcity, without any lack of resources, a society with such great technological abundance, will lay the basis for getting rid of the state altogether. A society where people can just do what they want to do, take what they have, but the root of it is scarcity. Inequality is rooted in scarcity. And that is the Marxist belief. But Marx was not a utopian. He didn't just go around explaining to people his ideas. Marx understood that history is driven forward by struggle, right? You have that thesis and that antithesis, and they clash, creating that synthesis that becomes the basis of the new thesis. And so Marx aligned himself with different social forces that existed in his time, making a point of supporting them in the advancing and exacerbating the contradiction to lay the basis for getting to a higher stage. The main force that Karl Marx supported was the labor movement and labor unions, organized labor. And he built the International Working Men's Association, the first international, as a group that organized labor and strikes. Marx was also a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln and the struggle to abolish slavery in the United States. Marx actually, he only had 2 jobs in his life. One job he had is he worked for a railroad, and his handwriting was too sloppy. He was nothing like Tristan, but his handwriting was too sloppy, so he was fired for working for the railroad. And then his second job was he was the London correspondent of the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party anti-slavery newspaper of New York City, run by Horace Greeley, who was a well-known abolitionist in New York City. And Marx, there was a general who worked with him, August Willich, who became a brigadier general in the Union Army, who fought against slavery. Marx was a firm supporter of Abraham Lincoln. But Marx didn't think Abraham Lincoln was a communist. Marx knew Abraham Lincoln was not a communist, but he understood that abolishing slavery would be a step forward, and that contradiction between the semi-feudal slave system of the South and the industrial capitalist system of the North could create struggle. And out of the struggle to abolish slavery, many great strides forward were made. We wouldn't have public education in this country if it weren't for the reconstruction of the South. The slave system was holding back the industrialization of the United States. So Karl Marx very much supported Abraham Lincoln. And it's interesting because there were some more radical forces around at the time. In the 1864 presidential election, you had the Democrats, who were running on a platform of immediately ending the war and signing a peace treaty with the South. You had Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, and he was running on a platform of don't change horses midstream, let me finish the job, let me finish the war. But there was also the radical Democratic Party, the Free Soilers. And they were running on a platform of Lincoln's a sellout. Lincoln's not radical enough. He's not doing enough to abolish slavery. But Karl Marx didn't endorse the Free Soilers. Karl Marx endorsed Abraham Lincoln because he knew that if Lincoln lost the election in 1864, that would represent a victory for the slaveholders, and that would keep the slave system intact. Another important detail is that the British Empire very much was supporting the slaveholders in the U.S. South and was supporting them. And Karl Marx was based in London. And one of the main reasons that the British Empire was supporting the slaveholders in the South is because they needed cheap cotton for their textile mills. And Karl Marx had been organizing labor unions among textile workers. So Karl Marx organized textile workers to refuse to work with any cotton picked by slaves and to protest and demonstrate in support of Abraham Lincoln. Another interesting detail is that the British were thinking about sending their navy to break the blockade around the South, to support the South and ensure the flow of cotton during the Civil War. And so Russia sent its navy to New York City. And the Russian navy docked in New York City's harbor, making a statement that if the British got involved, then the Russians would get involved. The Russians and the British were not getting along, so the Russians came to the side of Abraham Lincoln, and the British came to the side of the slaveholders. Very interesting history that we're not taught. Now, also, Karl Marx, he lived in London. He lived in exile most of his life. And he lived in Paris for a long time. And French political events during Karl Marx's life were very tumultuous. There was a lot of turmoil and unrest. In 1851, the Parliament of France was overthrown. There was a coup d'etat. And the nephew of Napoleon, Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, seized power. And it was the coup. And when that coup happened in 1851, Karl Marx was living there. And the coup was caused by a crisis of capitalism. The French ruling class was divided, and they were fighting among themselves. There was a group of conservatives called the Party of Order who were unhappy with all the strikes and demonstrations. They wanted to stabilize society, and many thought they were kind of monarchists. And then you had another faction, that was very radical and loved the tradition of the French Revolution. And so you had a coup. And Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III, took power and established kind of a military dictatorship. And Marx was living there. And he analyzed what happened. Was this a reactionary coup? Was it a progressive coup? Well, what was happening is what Marxists refer to as the phenomenon of Bonapartism. It's when there is divisions in the ruling class, when the capitalist society is in crisis, when there's unemployment, when there's strikes, when there's protests, when there's instability. One section of the ruling class will try to seize control of the government in order to use the government to stabilize society. And every capitalist wants the economy to get better, but every capitalist wants other capitalists to be the ones to pay for it. So they try to get their faction to seize control of the government and force the other capitalists to pay for it. And this is what happens when there is a capitalist crisis. The capitalists, I believe Cornelius Cardew, one of my fun composers, he says, the capitalists fight with one another to corner the markets and divide up the world. Their quest for maximum profit is the cause of war and puts us on the dole. Their greed leads us into a crisis, which they try to resolve with a more fascist state. But our struggle's against the whole capitalist system. So strike out the fascists as well as the cuts. That's what Karl Marx got us that understanding, that Napoleon III, he did a lot of progressive things. He built a lot of railroads. He created hospitals for poor people. But it was largely one section of the French ruling class trying to stabilize society. And that in order to do it, Louis Bonaparte built an army of lumpen proletarians, of desperately poor people and hippies and nonconformists and intellectuals to try and force society, to force his will onto society. It's kind of a fascinating thing we'll be talking about in the lecture this afternoon. But then later, 20 years later, in 1871, there had been a war between France and Prussia. The capitalist government of France surrendered in face of the Prussian invaders. So the working people of Paris rose up and they created the Paris Commune, which was the first dictatorship of the proletariat, the first working class government ever to be created. They seized control of the government and they had to create a new state. They couldn't just use the old government apparatus the capitalists had created. They had to create new institutions in order to do that. And this is where we get the understanding in Marxism that a revolutionary party puts forward its program, what it advocates. In the Communist Manifesto, there are 10 points that, public education, public control of banking and communication. There are 10 planks in the Communist Manifesto. That's the revolutionary program that Marxists put forward. And they organize and they rally people in the name of their program. And when they get elected, or when they are able to come to power, in order to enact their program, they have to create new state institutions. You can't enact a revolutionary working class program with a capitalist government. So you're going to need a new constitution, and you're going to need new procedures, and new bodies, and councils, and assemblies. And that new state apparatus that you create is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under capitalism, it's the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the dictatorship of the bankers and billionaires. But in order for the working class to assert its power, you need new institutions, and this is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it is with the dictatorship of the proletariat that the state, under working class control, can assert control over the economy. And you can have a centrally planned economy, and that is socialism. So these are three different things. You have the revolutionary program, you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, and ultimately you have socialism. And this is what we get from Karl Marx. So that is the first part of the first class. And so let's open up, and people can make whatever comments they want. Be sure to have the mic come to you when you speak. And that's section 1 of the first class.
Hey everybody, I'm Dust James, Marxist Linux truck driver.
Stand up.
Y'all might know me off the internet. I've heard that speech online, or at least variations of that speech, maybe 100 times, because I watch all of Caleb's videos. I think that, and it's good to understand this stuff, the way history's moving forward. My question or idea is, how do we break it down, and how do we convince, or at least talk to, the masses of people? How do we convince the Trump voter on the line next to us, or the Democrat voter, or the, just apolitical folks, or people in our community? How do we talk to them in a way that fits in their language and understandings and culture, and makes it relevant? And why is it relevant? And how do we convince them of its relevancy?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Very good.
So you brought up that Mao quote about one becoming two, and how socialism leads to a higher state of communism where there's post-scarcity. But how do we know that, under a new system, the next system, I guess, there isn't a different, how do we know the proletariat doesn't split into two, and then that will lead to a different kind of contradiction? You know what I mean?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so as far as what Dust James is talking about, I think that's the point, and that's what we've got to figure out, and that's what the Center for Political Innovation is set up to do, to find ways to get these concepts to be understood by people and make them accessible to people, and that is the project. That's why we are a think tank. We are not a party. There are people in multiple different parties in this room, and we need to develop literature and classes and public forums and any possible way to get these concepts to people. Now, as far as your point about how do we know the proletariat will not divide into two, well, the point is that at that point, the contradiction between humans and nature is ended, right? So there is no more scarcity. So the basis of the contradictions being the scarcity and the economic contradiction and the struggle for life, human beings struggling to survive, is eliminated. But history will march forward. In fact, many argue that communism, the higher stage of communism, is when history will truly begin, because that will be the freedom of human beings. For the first time, we won't be struggling to survive any longer. And so on that basis, human civilization and society will be far more vibrant than it is today. There'll be far more ideas, far more philosophy and thought, far more creativity. Human creativity will no longer be restrained by the struggle to survive. So there will be new contradictions, but the economic base of society will no longer be a restriction on it. So the contradictions in the economic base would be eliminated, but history does not end, obviously. History marches forward. So should we go on to the next section? All right, very good.